Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I have the privilege every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock to bring you interesting interviews with fascinating people. And, I'm actually recording this on a Sunday afternoon. I think that all of us are holed up at home, social distancing, physically distancing, and I decided that rather than socially distancing, what I would do is reach out to some of my classmates from a school that I went to. Gosh, how many years ago was that? I think 35 or 40 years ago, so it was a while ago, but that are spread out around the world, and canvass in with them, check in with them, see how they're doing, see how their families are doing, and see how the communities that they live in are doing. And so I'm really excited to bring you today a couple of fascinating people that I've had the privilege of arguing with and debating with and in discussions over case studies at Harvard Business School, but also I have a lot of respect for because they're wonderful people that I went out with on several occasions and enjoyed socially and got to know them as friends as well. And so I'm going to start with Girish, who joins us from Paris, France. Girish, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's evening for me here. It's 8 o'clock in the night.
Well, thank you for joining us. And you, I think, I've got your some of your family still in the United States, and you're alone in Paris. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm alone in Paris. My wife, my daughters, who are of course married, are back in Connecticut in the U.S. And this is not the best time for us to be traveling in either direction. So I guess for the next foreseeable future, we'll have to be on two separate continents.
And how you're communicating, I presume, through Skype and FaceTime and things like that, so you're able to stay close?
So far, yes. So we talk pretty often. I have a grandson as well. So
congratulations.
Thank you. And a granddaughter on the way in September. So hopefully I'll be back there in time for her birth. So yes, we use the usual FaceTime, WhatsApp, all the electronic media that's available to us.
And tell us what's going on in Paris.
Well, Paris has been under lockdown for the last 2 weeks. When the president recommended social distancing, the Parisians didn't particularly listen. They were still out there at bars and restaurants, and etc. So the only choice he felt was to actually order a lockdown. So we have now to stay in our homes. We can go out though for a few issues, things like you can go out for grocery shopping, you can go out to pharmacies, you can go out to walk your dog, you can go out for some form of emergency, you can even go out for an exercise. But each time you go out, you have to take a piece of paper, which you either print or you handwrite, where you have to say why you are leaving, what date it is, and what time you are leaving.
Really?
So every single day you're supposed to. So if I go grocery shopping, I don't have, unfortunately, a printer at home. So I have to handwrite it every time I go out as to why I'm going. And now they require you to have the date as well. So, and the time, so you can't sort of just have a.
It's fascinating, thing. As you undoubtedly know, and I've heard from the news reports, apps were created in South Korea and China that were very comparable to that from a monitoring standpoint. And in the bubonic plague in Europe, 500, 600 years ago, when you left the house, if you had someone that had the plague in your house, you had to carry a pole with hay on the top of it to signify that you might be infectious and people would stay away. So we're not there, hopefully, ever, but certainly yet. But thanks for that. So let's go to Steve in Chicago. Steve in Chicago, tell us what's going on in Chicago with your family, yourself, and the community, if you could.
Well, first of all, greetings from Chicago. My first cousin, so my mother and his mother, identical twin sisters, actually was diagnosed positive with the virus about 12 days ago. He took the test about 12 days ago, was finally diagnosed positive yesterday. So for the past 12 days, he's actually been dealing with the virus. He's actually recovering, but I've been getting play-by-play, day-by-day updates from him, and it's been, by and large, fairly terrible. But the good news is I think he's on the road to recovery and much better, but I've been understanding a lot more about the virus just by talking to my cousin and texting and emailing him. Yeah, so that's tough. Here in Chicago.
Your cousin's in Texas?
No, my cousin is in Detroit, Michigan.
Oh, okay.
So So that's just the U.S. on a personal basis. Here in Chicago, our governor issued a statewide disaster declaration on March 9th when we only had 11 known cases. The big news was a couple days later, they called off the St. Patrick's Day celebration. You might be familiar with in Chicago, they dye the river green, big St. Patrick's Day parade, very significant Irish population. All the festivities were canceled, and there were only 25 cases. And that was on March 11th. Fast forward till now, in Illinois, we have 3,491 cases. We had another 465 cases yesterday. Just over 1,500 of those cases are in Chicago, and we have 34 deaths. No, actually, we had 34 deaths yesterday. We now are up to 49 deaths in Illinois, including an infant. So I saw in the Chicago Tribune today that, I don't know how old the infant was, but I think the youngest person in the world just died of the coronavirus.
Oh, no.
So it's progressing quite rapidly here in Chicago.
Yeah.
And it's touched me personally on my first cousin.
Well, our best wishes for your cousin's health getting better. Roz, you're in Maryland?
Yes, I'm in Annapolis, Maryland.
And
All
what's
4 of my kids are home. 2 were already still living at home in high school, but 2 were in college, one a senior, one a freshman. So they've had to come home and kind of truncate their college experience. So 3 of the 4 are working virtually in school. 1 is in the public school system, which basically has said, here's some interesting videos if you want, and he doesn't want. So there's not much going on there. But so things here, our governor is, I think, doing a pretty good job and being fairly aggressive but transparent about shutdown, or as with other places, kind of rolling on a day-to-day basis. But we're now down to just non-essential businesses open.
Right.
So I have gotten out to do grocery shopping, and people are out. The shelves are still pretty bare. There are a couple small businesses that are getting innovative and doing things like closing the store to customer traffic, but just kind of taking phone orders and letting people pick them up curbside. So, you know, there are a lot of different sort of modes of businesses trying to stay intact. But one aside that I have that's not an Annapolis story, but my mother happens to live in an assisted living facility in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And that was pretty much ground zero for Louisiana. They have had 11 deaths in their assisted living facility. And the residents are not allowed to leave their apartments. There are no outside people coming or going. Tragically, a friend of mine from high school lost his mother during all this to a stroke and coronavirus, but the family wasn't able to see her, be with the father at bedside vigil or anything like that. So there's kind of the sad side in that assisted living facility in terms of just total isolation for people that are already otherwise pretty isolated.
So incredibly tough to.
It's really tough. And you know, the other side of that, and this is, you know, we haven't gotten into sort of the debate and the discussion about, but you know, from my mother's perspective, and I think I would say the same for my in-laws who are in their home in Arkansas and a little bit healthier, they'd say, you know, this is not how I want to spend my last years. Obviously, it's very scary for old people. And I say years, maybe even months, but I think they'd rather just kind of spend their last time in a state of camaraderie, not on a state of lockdown, and
right.
Kind of let nature take its course. And, you know, I know obviously there's a real range of how people feel about that, but it is kind of a sad state to people in their 80s in this situation where they are so completely isolated. So that's not in Annapolis, but that's in New Orleans, which is probably a more interesting side of this virus because their assisted living alone, their facility has really been hit hard.
Well, and it's a worldwide story, in fact. And so I do think that this terminology of social distancing is completely wrong. It should be physical distancing and social. We should be trying to connect. And so I really appreciate all of you connecting up with me today and with my listeners here in Toronto. Jeff Carroll, where are you?
Charlotte, North Carolina. And we had Charlotte declared a total stay-at-home order of a little over a week ago. And North Carolina declared a stay-at-home order effective Monday. We've been pretty much staying put for about 2 weeks. And we can talk in a little bit about how it really hasn't affected, you know, how I conduct my day-to-day life because of the way we were set up here. But a neat aside is I did I was doing some consulting work 2 weeks ago, and I was in Texas, and I had some additional consulting work in Kansas and in Delaware and in Maryland and in Virginia. And I bit the bullet and just got behind the wheel and drove 3,500 miles and did everything I needed to do in the field so I could get back to North Carolina and just work for the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I had a chance to, hit, rest stops and convenience stores and fast food places all across the United States when I did this. And at night, you'd see the trucks just lined up for a mile, going into an entrance ramp to a rest stop. The entire rest stop was covered with trucks, and there's another mile of trucks on the way out, both sides, east and west on the I-70. And it was really kind of made me proud to be an American. I'm looking at this saying, these people are moving stuff to market. Yeah. And in the face of stuff that's going on and uncertainty, there's a lot of hero stories coming out of this, and I think our world heroes are going to be the people in the trenches, not only people in the hospitals, but people moving stuff to market, producing products that are necessary for people. And it's fascinating to watch how people just change, they adapt to this new reality, and stuff's still getting done. So I hope it ends soon. But in the meantime, it's kind of neat to watch everyone adapt.
Well, I appreciate all of you joining us for the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're going to take a break for messages, and then we're going to come back with more discussion with my friends from across, not just North America, but including Paris, France, so across the world. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. I'm doing a canvas with some of my former classmates from Harvard Business School back. We graduated in 1988. So, lots of you probably weren't born then, but I thought it would be interesting to sort of canvas with some of my friends from across the world what's going on. And maybe, Girish, I could start with you. Italy and Spain have been sort of the epicenters, and people are wondering whether that's what's coming to the United States and Canada. Do you think that the politicians, the government, the public health people reacted too late in Italy and Spain? Do you have an impression on that?
At least from Italy's perspective, it would appear to be so. And to be fair, I think people didn't fully realize the power of this virus. And when things started getting difficult, people started traveling from there and going back to wherever they came from, and they took it with them. So I think some of the earlier places, there was a lot of learning to be done as to how this thing worked, didn't work. And you have to also recognize that, without stereotyping, there are cultures which are more obedient and there are cultures which are less obedient to authorities. So in a place like Korea, you could instruct the population what to do, and the compliance rate was pretty high. In a place which is like Italy or even France or other places, people don't necessarily comply. And I'm sure some of you have seen videos of the various Italian mayors running around screaming at people, telling them to go home. Yeah. And so to some of that, it's a range of things, lack of familiarity, not knowing what was happening, how potent this was, and then just a population which, unless it was fined or compelled, just wasn't listening to advice.
Steve, you're in Chicago, a major urban center in the United States. New York, obviously, is the current hotspot and has been hit quite hard. And some people, at least public health authorities, are saying, other major cities across the United States, like Chicago, like Boston, like Los Angeles, like Detroit, et cetera, have got to learn from what was done right and what was done wrong in New York. And it sounds like you were put into stay-at-home rules fairly early before the caseload became too high. And so do you think that you're doing the right things? Your mayors and governors are doing the right thing in Chicago?
Yeah, I think the mayors are doing the right thing. I think the governor is doing the right thing. I think, to Girish's point, there's a segment of the population that don't want to stereotype them, but think they might be infallible. and that the rules don't apply to them. So for instance, on St. Patrick's Day weekend, the party was off, the river wasn't dyed, and yet a number of young people in their 20s hit the bars anyhow, hit the bars hard. And the mayor and the governor were disgusted. I mean, they could not believe that here we have this statewide disaster declaration, and all these young people are hitting the bars. So they closed the bars. So now there's no longer closed restaurants. You can no longer go out for food and sit in. You can no longer go out for beer. Everything is on a curbside basis because a number of people, like what happened in Florida at the beaches, felt rules didn't apply to them. So I think most of the people are obedient. If you look at Michigan Avenue, which is Chicago's main thoroughfare, it's empty. If you look at the highways, they're empty. And slowly but surely, look at all the pictures, they're empty. People are listening. The state parks are empty. The playgrounds are closed. So hopefully people are listening. But I'm glad we did it early. Now that it's been 3 weeks, we should have done it even earlier. But when the state was disaster declaration, there were only 11 known cases in Illinois, and people thought, this is crazy. 11 known cases, what are you doing? Now we have 3,500 cases 3 weeks later, and it's still growing. So I'm very proud of the governor, very proud of the mayors, but I'd like everybody to obey and be obedient to the rules and regulations because they apply to everybody.
I had the former top civil servant from Ontario, so our province here in Canada, on my show 2 days ago, and he was fascinating because he said the problem with this kind of a public health epidemic is you've got to take your actions before you know you've got to, or people really recognize that you've got to. And he says, Brian, it's the same thing as heart disease. If you wait till you have the heart attack, it's too late to change your diet and start exercising. You've got to start doing the diet and exercising years before you end up having your heart problems. And you can think about other health issues as an example. He said, you've got to take these actions that we're taking before you have those first couple of cases, let alone those first couple of deaths. And if you wait until everyone realizes and recognizes that this is an issue, you've waited too long. And so therefore, maybe Roz or Jeff, I could ask you, clearly the major urban centers, Paris, Toronto, Chicago, New York, have been hit harder. But if this epidemic continues, the infection rate continues, it's going to start hitting the South, the smaller cities. Do you think that your people, your governors, your mayors are taking the appropriate actions early enough?
Yeah.
Go, Roz.
I think our governor is, we're a small enough town that we don't hear so much from the mayor on this. It's really more the governor, and we are the capital of the state. So that's part of why. But I think he's been aggressive. He's been appropriately aggressive. And I agree that you have to get out ahead of it before anyone recognizes the necessity. I guess for me, the question is at the back end of when things are going to ease up, because the issue, the toll on people's finances, livelihoods, and emotional well-being, especially the people that are, now not working in the restaurants and athletic clubs and all of those people that really live paycheck to paycheck. I just don't see where the end is and how those people are going to kind of get through this. So I think, yes, they have done the right thing so far, but the big question to come, and what's going to be even more controversial, I think, is when it's okay to let up.
So this happened in 1919 during the Spanish flu epidemic, and there's great case studies of exactly this kind of pressure, and it's fascinating. The cities that kept the pressure on in regards to isolation had substantially lower death rates, substantially lower mortality. And there's a couple of examples of cities in the United States and case studies that have been done where mayors and governors fell to pressure to open up. They opened up and the death rate skyrocketed. And the answer in the end was, yeah, the economy might have done better, but it was at the cost of hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Yeah, there's going to be no right answer, and we'll never know what it would have looked like under a different scenario than whatever scenario we follow. But I'm not discounting the medical need currently, but the reality for so many people is going to be very hard to dig out of, and that's where I think it's going to get really hard. Because of public pressure, and especially because of mounting death tolls, no matter when we let up, you can't eradicate this 100%. And unless, I don't understand the science behind it, but unless we can do 100% testing or, 100% vaccination, which we know is not going to happen in any short order time, even if we thought we had gotten it down to one person, once everybody's out and about again, it grows right back up. So there's never going to be a time when someone can say, okay, let's go back to business as usual and not run the risk that there will continue to be infections. It's just, so reality wise, what are we going to do? Keep us under lockdown for 2 years? I mean, I just don't know how we're going to find the right line.
I think part of the answer, Roz, is once a certain number, and I believe it's 65%, I could be wrong, either get vaccinated or infected, you then develop herd immunity. And once you develop herd immunity, it then doesn't spread as quickly or rapidly as possible. Because the concern is, as you rightly point out, if the mayors or governors succumb to pressure and you open up too soon, and then you have a second and a third wave, which is as deadly, if not more deadly, then you would really not benefit economically because people will be too scared to go out at all. So at which point, what have you really achieved? So it is a tough question, but there is a number by which it doesn't have to be 100%. It is a high number, but it's not 100% to achieve herd immunity.
Well, on the other side, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to say the give and take on the herd immunity is if you're locked up and isolated, you don't get exposed to it, and people don't acquire a herd immunity. So, it's a real tough balancing act. My issue is the elected officials who put us into isolation. They should have. I get it. It's terrible for the people that get sick. This is an awful, awful illness. They have a different set of incentives associated with their decisions than maybe a business person has. And as a result, I fear that they may keep us cooped up longer than they need to. And I just don't know. I mean, the safe answer for politicians is to say, when there's no more cases, we'll let you out. And I don't know what the calculus is for deciding it's time to let people go.
The other variable too is as we, put more ventilators into circulation and hospital beds into circulation, do you come to a point where you say, we're raising the bar on how many people can get sick because the survival rate is more manageable now? Do we sort of have to say it's okay to allow the numbers to go up to a certain point?
But if you take a look at the graphs, and probably you like I am looking at those graphs on either the internet or the TV every day, they're going straight up, and so therefore all the isolation measures that have been taken have not yet stopped that graph from going up, and so people are still getting infected and people are still recovering. And so as people get infected and recovering, we're creating that herd immunity that Girish you talk about. And so what the key is clearly flattening the curve. And I'm not sure what it's like in your communities, but the statistics just in Toronto, and we're the hardest hit city in Canada, and nothing like what's going on in New York. But our hospitals are full, and we can't take much more. And we're right at that first part of the incline of the curve. We haven't nearly reached the apex as of yet. And so therefore, to let people out of isolation now would mean that hundreds of thousands of people will end up dying. And on the press today, they were talking about scenarios in the United States of between 500,000 and 50 million people dying, depending on whether you're flattening the curve or allowing the curve to peak. And that's got to be, Governor Cuomo, New York State, said you can't put a price on people's lives.
Hey, Brian, Steve here. I know Toronto and Chicago are roughly the same size in terms of population. Do you have a sense of how many cases there have been in Toronto? There's about 3,500 here in Illinois. So Illinois is not the same as Chicago, I get that. But do you have a sense how many cases there have been either in Toronto or Canada, just comparing apples to apples to the best we can?
So Canada, I'll get you the statistics. Canada is, from a population standpoint, per capita base, doing better than the United States. We're 1/10 your size. and we've got about 1/25 of your cases right now. Now, whether that is because we don't have the density of New York, and clearly, New York City skews the United States statistics fairly dramatically. It probably was circulating in New York City earlier than any other place, other than maybe Washington State in the United States. And to Girish's comment, maybe Canadians are a little bit more. What was the way you described it?
Obedient.
Polite. Polite.
Polite.
And, to be frank, I watch both Canadian news and American news, as you can well imagine, as you probably remember from some of my comments in class eons and eons ago. We're not nearly as partisan, and so you watch your news. You have very different points of view presented by the different political parties, and different parts of your country. And I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but it's different. In Canada, there's a far more of Team Canada, listen to the scientific experts, do what they're saying, be more obedient, as Girish said. And so you don't have like the governor of Louisiana, who a couple days ago was, suggesting let's all go out and get infected almost. And then, yesterday I hear that New Orleans has had as many deaths so far as actually more deaths as Hurricane Katrina. And so therefore this has been as big, if not a bigger disaster than something we were all watching on the news, when was it, 15 years ago? And so I think that the statistics in Canada so far have been better because probably we're more obedient. Bernie Sanders would probably tell you that it's got something to do as well with our healthcare system that has got more capacity per capita than your healthcare system. And our public healthcare system that is completely government funded. But that said, who knows? Our graphs are looking pretty bad.
Two points here, Brian. One is it takes 14 days to incubate, and so the impact of the lockdown will take a while to be felt. That's one. And there are lots of people walking around who are asymptotic, and so they don't have the symptoms. And so it's very easy to either give them, transmit, etc. But the other point I also want to make is just think about this. The disease emerges in Wuhan, and in a few months, it's literally all over the world, right? As a result of which, you really cannot rest just because your city or your region or your state or even your country has brought it under control. And as the former chief economist of the IMF, Raghuram Rajan, said in the FT a few days ago, that for you to be able to travel anywhere, it has to be beaten everywhere. Because you really cannot afford that have a second wave and a third wave until such time as we have reached herd immunity. And so it's not just the governor of Louisiana, but also the president of Mexico and the president of Brazil who worry me, because they don't seem to be taking this seriously. In fact, Bolsonaro is clearly not taking it seriously. And at some point, this is going to start all over again, or could start all over again, if people start traveling from Brazil to other places.
Yeah.
Right. We were talking about the herd immunity statistics earlier. I just did some back of the envelopes for the province that this originated from in China. There's only just a small percentage of the people that live there that were infected. And if you look at the number of infections in the various states around the United States, just a small percentage. Now, we aren't testing, so I suspect that vastly larger numbers of people have been infected and haven't even known it, which is another thing. If that's true, if more people have been infected and haven't even known it, then the mortality statistics, those percentages are actually much smaller than what's been reported, because it's the number of deaths divided by the number of infections. Mortality, there's so many things that we don't know. And at some point in the next half year, I think we'll have a better handle on the kinetics of this thing. And I've been watching these statistics change, and I've been watching them close because they were really scary at first, but they've moderated. At first they were saying 3.5% mortality rate, and it's down. They're saying it's 1.5% now, and I've heard some people say it's below 1% if you actually look at all the people that really have been infected. So we just don't know, but it makes a lot of sense in the meantime to just be careful not to pass it on. The other thing too is the initial statistics were saying that young people, barely any chance of anything happening to you. And that's why they're running around licking toilet seats and partying and doing crazy stuff, because they don't think that it's going to affect them. They don't realize, they don't think about how it connects to and could possibly jeopardize somebody who's older. So anyway, we're learning a lot. We're all interconnected.
Well, I think one of the interesting cautions that's come out just in the last little while, probably because it wasn't an issue in China, but is that teenagers or young adults that have been vaping and or smoking are potentially very susceptible to the virus. And so therefore, the statistic for teenagers in other parts of the world where vaping may not have been as prevalent may have been misguiding the rest of us internationally. It is fascinating that there's been, I think, one death of someone under the age of 9 worldwide. And
well,
so,
there was one in Chicago, remember last night, an infant who was less than a year, it's a couple months old. That literally just happened, breaking news. So it might be 2.
So very clearly may not be 0, but it's going to be low. In answer to your question, Steve, in Toronto, there's been 1,326 infections.
So much smaller than here in Illinois, where there's about 3,500. The question is, what's the slope of the curve? Is the slope?
Now, the other thing is, I don't know if you've got how many have been tested. So we have had.
I do. There's been 20, as of last night, in Illinois, so don't have to Chicago. Illinois has roughly 12.7 million people. And there have been 21,542 tests as of last night. So
okay,
21,000.
Ontario would probably be half that size, maybe 3/4 of that size. We've tested 40,000, so twice as many. So and early testing, as you've heard in your press like crazy, is one of the solutions because you can track where it is and take more drastic measures in different areas. And so that would be, and that maybe is in to be political for a second again, would argue in favor of what Bernie Sanders has been arguing on your press. But clearly capacity for testing and early testing is one of the potential solutions so that you can track it. And as you said, well, both Jeff and Garish, 8 have been resolved, but a whole bunch have been cleared. So of that, 30,000 are negative.
So one of the issues is most people don't always believe the statistics coming out of China, whether it's for economics or other things, right? I mean, they have their own way of trying to control the news, manage the news, spin the news, whatever. And we also know the story about the doctor who tried to, sound the alarm, but he was reprimanded, etc. And so in a time like this, if people don't believe what you're saying, they don't know how to respond or to do things. Either they overdo it or they underdo it, etc. And I'm sorry to say that we have a similar problem in the US, where the kind of, our president has sort of changed all over the place, from it'll disappear in a few days to it's a hoax to whatever. And if it wasn't for people like the doctors or the Dr. Fauci, etc., I don't think it serves, and not to mention the right-wing media and others who are belittling this or it's one thing to say, listen, guys, we need more information, be factual, be scientific, etc. But this whole culture about not believing experts or looking down on science or even belittling government is coming back to bite us at this point.
Can I jump in for a sec? So
Actually, Steve, can I cut you
Go ahead.
off? We're going to take a quick break for messages and we'll come back to you just in a minute. Everyone, fascinating conversation with people from around the world about the COVID-19 epidemic. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having just a fantastic time chatting with some of my classmates, and we've got lots of different points of view, which we all did 35, 40 years ago as well. And so it's fun to remind myself about who had different political and different scientific and different organizational points of view 35 years ago, and seeing them chat today. Steve, I cut you off. I apologize. You were saying something about a company in Chicago?
Yeah, so first of all, to Girish's point, the role of trust is so incredibly important. And a company in Chicago called Edelman Public Relations, now just known as Edelman, it's headquartered between Chicago and New York. For the past 20 years or so, their CEO named Richard Edelman has been putting together something called Edelman Trust Barometer. And every year he goes literally around the globe. He goes to Davos, he goes to Chicago Economic Club, he goes to the cities where Edelman is, and talks about the role of trust. And I was at Edelman Trust Barometer meeting in Chicago 2 months ago when he was talking about the role of trust. And unfortunately, to Girish's point, the government now is one of the least trustworthy sources. One of the most trustworthy sources, I say the federal government. The federal government is one of the least trustworthy sources. Highest on the list are governors and doctors. So we have this disconnect between who do you trust? We have the federal government saying one thing, the state government saying another thing. We have doctors, and the public, by and large, is very confused as to who to trust. People want to trust certain elements, but then if those elements or those entities change on a day-to-day basis, it's very confusing. So the role of trust is so incredibly important that Girish mentioned. I just wanted to highlight that. And I also like to put in a plug for the Edelman Trust Barometer. It might be worthwhile reading it because they talk about this at length.
So I've been a student of American politics from afar for a long time. And I got to tell you, I have been personally extremely impressed with Governor Cuomo from the state of New York. I find him trustworthy. I find him factual. I find that he's got a depth of knowledge that is astounding of what's going on in both New York City as well as the state. And I haven't felt that way about, with all due respect, your president. How do the different political leaders play for those of you that are in the United States?
Yeah, let me kind of weigh in on this. I'm an independent, admittedly socially right of center, but would never want to impose, my points of view, use government to impose my points of view on anybody else. Okay, so it's kind of how I operate. I don't think there's anyone in any elected office that wants to do anything but try to get through this thing, and to get through this thing with as few of deaths as possible, and with try to preserve the economy. I don't think there's anyone who's malevolent. Okay, I think the various fixes are across the spectrum, and there are a lot of different opinions on that. And there's certainly a whole lot of different ways of communicating. And our president has a certain way of communicating that really riles people up and is often not productive. Okay, so I'm willing to give it that. But the partisanship that I've been watching on social media, it revolts me. It really annoys me. It just let's get through this thing. Let's stop trying to score political points. Let's stop trying to tear one guy down and build another one up. Let's just get through this thing. And I think Cuomo's doing he's making the right calls. I think Trump has surrounded himself with a good team. I think Trump needs to stay off his Twitter a little bit more, but it is what it is. I mean, we knew that before we got into this.
Jeff, let me ask you a question. I've actually been extremely impressed with your vice president. I wasn't impressed with him previously, but he seems to be very competent, detail-oriented, and coming forward with the facts. What's your impression?
Yeah, I think he's got a team of people that he's working with, and he's deferring to them. He's been a chief executive of the state of Indiana, so he knows kind of how to handle these emergency calls, and he's had a bit of experience with it. So I think he's done a fairly good job. But I think they're all just trying to get us through this thing.
Let me point out that his experience on something similar in his state was tremendously bad for the HIV crisis. And I would urge you to go back and see, just do your own research in terms of how he handled it. And he is rightly blamed.
Do you think he may have learned something from that and is now taking this more seriously and listening to the scientists?
I certainly hope so. But the hallmark of this administration seems to be anti-expert. But let me sort of go back a little bit to
Well, let me
Jeff's
challenge
point.
you on that for a
Sure.
second, Girish.
Yeah.
This Tony Fauci guy,
Yeah.
I think if he ran for president, he'd win. The guy is so believable and honest and trustworthy, and he even stands up, sort of, not completely, but almost stands up to Trump on the podium. Like, he's an impressive guy, and so there are
fully agreed. Fully agreed.
I'm impressed with Deborah Birx. Deborah
Yeah.
Birx, she's very, very impressive. And,
but
and
I
she
would
seems
point
to have
out
a good handle on her stuff.
Yeah.
So
I would point out 2 articles in the New York Times. One is about a significant amount of consternation in the Trump White House about whether or not to continue with Fauci because he seems to be disagreeing with the president. Secondly, the right-wing media has gone haywire on their vitriol on Dr. Fauci, okay? And so to come back to my point earlier, yes, different people can have different opinions. I fully agree. But in law, there is negligence and there is intent. And very often in certain crimes, you have to prove intent and that negligence isn't enough. However, if negligence rises to the level of gross negligence, the law assumes intent. In other words, you can't fire a gun in a crowd and say, I didn't intend to kill John because I didn't even know John was standing there. In fact, I don't even know John. Okay. So when governors like in Louisiana and other places make their statements, it's not just a difference of opinion. It rises to the level of gross negligence. And I would therefore attribute intent there. And not just, you can't say, hey, it's an opinion issue. It's beyond opinion at that point.
Well,
why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? Why don't we get out? Why don't we fix the problem and get out of the problem, and then we can worry about fixing blame. Okay? When we're looking 2020 in the rearview mirror, and we can kind of do a post-mortem on this thing, we'll understand a whole lot more about where we made bad calls and which ones were, which ones were really, really fatal, and which ones weren't. So the partisanship is just destructive and isn't helpful. It really isn't. I don't know.
I agree with Jeff. It's frustrating to listen to.
In order to fix the problem, though, who do we listen to? I think the person to listen to is Tony Fauci, because he understands the problem. I think many people who are politicians, whether liberal, conservative, Democrat, or Republican, don't actually understand the nature of the problem, because the problem is a medical problem. And unless you're a doctor, we have a benefit of Girish actually being a doctor on this call. He's also a lawyer. It's also an MBA. He's everything. Girish. But we need a doctor to actually diagnose and fix the problem. I want to listen. If I have something wrong with me, an illness, I'm not going to go talk to a politician. I'm going to go see a doctor. And this is actually a medical problem. And I think we need a medical solution, not a political solution. So I'd rather have one person. I think Tony Fauci is by far and away the most trusted person in the country, if not the world, on this problem. Whatever Tony Fauci says, I have no idea if he's Republican, Democrat, liberal, or conservative, but he's a doctor who understands this and is the foremost expert. And I'd rather put my faith and confidence in him and just tell other politicians to please slide off the stage. Let's listen to Tony.
I think Fauci's been around under multiple administrations on both sides of the aisle. And the New York Times might be talking about some consternation within the administration. I have a hard time believing that anyone's going to pull the plug on him. I'm glad he's there. I'm glad he's there with maybe a polar opposite opinion from the president to and he's putting it out there too. Clearly, he's expressing his own point of view, and I'm glad he's doing that. That's his job.
Yeah. By the way, Steve, you're right. You go to the doctor, right? But there is a difference between personal medicine and population-based medicine. So you go to the Kennedy School to study population-based medicine. Now you're coming more and more into policy areas. Now you're tipping more and more into financial, economic, social, political implications, right? Which is not to say that you don't listen to your doctor, but the issues and the trade-offs and the complications become quite different when you're talking about population-based medicine than when you're talking about retail medicine. And at which point, whether you like it or not, it does become quote unquote political, and political decisions have to be made, hopefully with the right advice from epidemiologists and people like that.
We're going to take another break and come back with some concluding comments from my friends across the world. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I have had so much fun chatting with some of my classmates from business school a couple of decades ago, and also getting a read for what's going on around the world. And we've had a debate about science versus politicians, and whether partisanship is good or bad. And you know what? It just reminds me of the wonderful discussions that I had with them a while ago. And I think this is what we need to do. We need to not be socially distant. We need to be physically distant, but we need to be socially close. And guys, I really appreciate you all joining me today. Thank you so much. Anyway, I've got one final question, and that is twofold. Number one, what do you think we need to do with the economy given this current pressure? And number two, do you have a message for my listeners both in Toronto and around the world? Steve, why don't we start with you?
So while we're going through a difficult time, there's some positives that have come out of this. I spent a great deal of time with my family. I spent a great deal of time taking a step back. I've always shook hands. I've done many things that my wife had told me I should not do, should watch myself. And I'm learning my family, my wife, the community, just trying to take a step back and be appreciative for what we have, for our health that we take for granted, for our family that sometimes we take for granted, for all these things that I, for the past 30 years, have taken for granted. It's given me a great deal of perspective. And if and when, and it's a when we get through this, I'm going to be looking at the glass, not that I always haven't, but is really 2/3 full or 3/4 full or 80% full. And I think there's a lot we can take of this to be positive as we go forward. One person's take.
Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, something that's interesting, all of the prescriptions to, to work from home and, to school your kids at home, to worship on Sunday morning from home. Those are things that we've been doing. I had a home office for the last 23 years. We homeschooled our kids for 18 years, and we've actually been worshiping out of our home for 5 years now. So none of that's really changed my life a lot. And I'm kind of glad some other people have had a chance to experience what we've been doing, because it's really rich. I even have a full gym here at home. So I've got what I need here to be able to operate. This is going to have a pretty significant impact on my business. I develop workforce housing. And I was like 2 weeks away from closing the first of 6 of a kind of a new, type of deal. I'm retooling. And what I'm thinking about is I not only need to develop workforce housing, but I need to offer workforce training to make people recession proof. And so what's going to come out of this, I think it's going to be good ultimately for my business. It will take some retooling. I hope that the public health people and the economists can figure out where the two curves cross here. And we can get out not a minute earlier than we need to, but not a minute later either. And I don't know what that calculus looks like, but this whole thing underscores the fact of how interconnected we all are.
No question.
And it's just, it's fascinating. You look at the world maps and you say, we are really interconnected. So anyway, hope and pray we get out of this thing, with minimal fatalities.
Roz, what's your message to people?
I'd say first on a micro level, it's wonderful having the whole family together with no distractions and no alternate plans for anybody. We're kind of reconnecting in a way before everybody launches off into the real world that we probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to do. So in that sense, it's been kind of a silver lining and reconnecting with old friends. I had my 40th high school reunion on Zoom, and we had better attendance than we ever would have had in person. So in that sense, it's great. I think the other side of this, though, on a little bit more macro, but still kind of local level, is I think we're all really not only understanding, but appreciating more what every citizen's role is in our day-to-day lives, and how important the person who stocks the groceries is, and how important the person is who delivers the groceries to the store, and people who provide the entertainment venues, and every little interaction that we touch is now becoming more valuable to us, and we're sort of appreciating every sort of piece of that delivery. And I find on the rare occasion when I do go to the grocery store, people are stopping and talking to clerks and thanking them. And just, I think we'll all have a new appreciation of, this isn't big corporate America is the bad guy. Big corporate America is the guy who is putting groceries on your shelf and, getting it from here to there. It's all people. And I think we're seeing the bits and pieces of that more acutely now.
I think we're recognizing who really are our essential workers, and healthcare unquestionably are, but so are our store clerks and our pharmacists and things like that. No question. Girish, second last word to you, sir.
Well, just to build on what my colleagues have said, we've all seen these cartoons of family gatherings where all the people are watching their smartphones, nobody's talking to each other, and no matter where you are, people walking down the streets looking at their iPhones, etc. I'm hoping something like this will once again teach us the value of our fellow human beings, and that we actually start connecting with each other, not just through instant messages and WhatsApps and Facebook Messenger, but face to face, touching each other, talking to each other, looking into each other's eyes, and sort of reconnect humanity again. That to me would be a tremendous outcome. And if I may just add one more thing, I would like all of you and your listeners to sort of pray for me, because my wife being away, she is the world's best cook. And now I'm suddenly faced with having to cook for myself. And I am undoubtedly the world's worst cook. So the question is, what's going to get me first, the virus or my own cooking? So if you can pray for me, for my cooking to improve, and unless there is a vaccination developed for that, I'm a little scared.
Girish, we're all praying for survival of your cooking.
We hope you get back with your wife here very soon. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that she recovers well, very well. Well, I've got to say that we talked about interconnectedness, and unquestionably we are, and it's wonderful for me. It's a huge pleasure for me to connect with the four of you, and so thank you so much for joining me today and helping me out with doing a canvas around the world. I think if I've got a message, it is that I had the pleasure of interviewing a Buddhist monk the other day, and what he said is, you have to, in anything that happens to you in life, see if there's a silver lining. And Raj, you talked about the silver lining being that you got together with your family before you're all launched off into all different directions. And I think that unquestionably is silver lining. But what he said, which was interesting, he said, just consider that maybe this is Mother Nature's way of telling us to slow down and think about what's really important, and look on the inside, and that, who's in your home, who's in your life. And who are those critically important people that you want to talk to at the most important times in life. And whether you do that over a dinner table or whether you do that over Skype. I'm going to do an interview with my mom, who doesn't live in my city, and she's an art history major, a docent in art galleries, and we're going to do a whole program on art appreciation, which is something we've talked about doing for a long period of time, but we never got around the time to doing it. And we're going to do it on Zoom and record it for posterity. So, whether it's connecting with your people live over the dinner table that Roz, sounds like you're going to have the privilege of doing, or Girish via FaceTime with your wife a continent away, connect up with those people that are so critically important with you. And you know what? Some of the best years of my life were arguing with you guys around our section in Boston eons ago. And it's a pleasure to connect up with you again. I hope we can do this again sometime soon. So thank you so much for joining me. And
Pleasure.
Have a great
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Enjoyed
us.
it.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Thanks.